Dawn had not yet broken over the North Pacific. On the flight deck of the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi, 200 miles north of Hawaii, 38 Mitsubishi Zeros sat in tight rows. Deck crews in white cloth caps moved between them, wiping frost from canopies, checking oil pressure, checking hydraulic lines, checking the belts of 20mm cannon shells slotted into the wing bays. It was Sunday morning, the 7th of December, 1941. In the cockpit of the lead fighter, a Japanese pilot pushed his throttle forward. The Nakajima Sake radial engine coughed once, then caught, then howled. 14 cylinders drinking aviation fuel from tanks that had no armor and no way to seal themselves if a bullet came through. 200 miles to the south, in a berth along Battleship Row, a young sailor aboard the USS Arizona stepped out onto the main deck with a tin cup of coffee. It was still cool at that hour. He could hear church bells drifting across the harbor from Ford Island. He watched the sun rise over the mountains behind Honolulu. He did not look up. He had no reason to look up. He did not know what was already in the sky, closing on him at over 200 miles per hour, designed and built in a room in central Japan by a man he had never heard of, 4 years before he had ever put on a uniform. Turn the calendar back. October 1937. A city in central Honshu called Nagoya. Inside the offices of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, a Japanese engineer named Jiro Horikoshi opened a sealed envelope from the Imperial Japanese Navy. He was 34 years old. He had graduated from the University of Tokyo 10 years earlier from the newly established Aviation Laboratory, one of the first cohorts trained specifically to design aircraft. He was quiet. He was precise. He wore a plain suit and thick, round glasses. He had already designed one successful fighter for the Navy, the A-5M Claude, a nimble little monoplane with fixed landing gear and an open cockpit that was tearing Chinese Air Force biplanes out of the sky over Shanghai and Nanking. The Navy trusted him. They also expected the impossible from him. The specification in the envelope was called 12 Shi. It ran to several pages of typed Japanese characters. Horikoshi read it slowly. Then he read it again. The Navy wanted a carrier-based fighter. That in itself was ordinary. What was not ordinary was what the Navy wanted the fighter to do. They wanted a maximum speed, above 300 miles per hour. They wanted a climb to 10,000 feet in 3.5 minutes. They wanted maneuverability equal to or better than the A-5M Claude, the most agile carrier aircraft in the world at that time. They wanted 2 20mm cannon in the wings. They wanted 2 7.7mm machine guns in the fuselage. They wanted a full radio set. They wanted a direction finder for long-range navigation. And they wanted range. They wanted a fighter that could fly 6 to 8 hours at economical cruising speed. A round trip of over 1,500 miles. No fighter on Earth had that range. No carrier fighter came close to those numbers. The men who had written the specification were not engineers. They were Imperial Japanese Navy officers who had spent the last 3 years watching their pilots fight across the vast interior of China. They understood distance in a way that European navies did not. They knew the Pacific was a different ocean. Horikoshi set the pages down on his desk. Every requirement in that envelope demanded a lighter aircraft. More range meant more fuel, and fuel had weight. More cannon meant heavier guns and heavier ammunition. More power meant a bigger engine, and Japanese aero engines in 1937 produced 20 to 30% less power than the engines being built in Ohio, in Coventry, in Stuttgart. Horikoshi knew this. Every aircraft designer in Japan knew it. To meet the Navy's numbers, he would have to build an airframe so light that the power gap disappeared. He would have to remove weight from every joint, every rib, every rivet, every square centimeter of aluminum skin. He would have to build a fighter that weighed less than any American or British engineer would consider structurally sound. The Navy sent the same specification to a second Japanese company, Nakajima, the largest aircraft manufacturer in Japan. Their factories in Ota and Musashino employed thousands. Their engineering staff was deep, experienced, and well-funded. Nakajima's team studied the 12 requirements for 3 months. They ran the calculations. They looked at the weight budgets. They looked at the engine options. In January of 1938, Nakajima withdrew from the competition. Their letter to the Navy was polite and technical. The specification, they wrote, exceeded the physical limits of current aircraft design. It could not be built, not by Nakajima, not by anyone. Mitsubishi received the letter. Horikoshi received the letter. He was now alone, but his superiors at Mitsubishi hesitated. The company already had a Navy bomber contract on the production floor. Taking on an impossible fighter specification when the largest competitor in the country had just declared it undeliverable was not the kind of risk business executives welcomed. There were meetings in the Nagoya offices. There were arguments. Horikoshi pushed hard. He believed there was a way through. He asked for the design team, the resources, and the authorization to pursue an extreme weight reduction strategy that would violate several conventions of modern fighter design. Mitsubishi agreed. The bomber project was shelved. Horikoshi got his team. They worked in a long room on the upper floor of the Nagoya aircraft plant. Drafting tables lined the walls. Slide rules clicked, blueprints unrolled across the floor. Horikoshi walked between the tables, checking calculations, adjusting angles, redrawing spars. He was not a warm man. His engineers respected him, but did not fear him. He asked one question of every component brought to his desk. Where can we remove weight? The answer he arrived at would define both the triumph and the tragedy of the machine that came out of that room. He chose to build the airframe from a new aluminum alloy called Extra Super Duralumin, designated T7178. It was stronger than standard aircraft aluminum. Stronger meant he could make the structural members thinner. Thinner meant lighter. He designed the wings around a single continuous spar with the fuel tanks integrated directly into the wing structure. He joined the fuselage in 2 major sections with a ring of 80 bolts. Engine, cockpit, wing. One rigid unit. It was elegant. It saved weight at every seam. But none of these decisions on their own would meet the Navy's numbers. What met the numbers was the decision Horikoshi made about protection. Every fighter under development in the late 1930s, in the United States, in Britain, in Germany, was adding survivability features. Steel plate behind the pilot's seat to stop rifle-caliber rounds. Self-sealing fuel tanks with layered rubber that closed around bullet holes and prevented the fuel from leaking and igniting. These features had emerged from the hard lessons of the First World War and the Spanish Civil War, where thousands of pilots had died burning in cockpits that offered no defense against a single lucky shot. Horikoshi removed them before they were ever installed. No armor plate behind the pilot's seat, no self-sealing bladders around the fuel tanks, no protection for the pilot's head, no fireproofing around the engine bay. The Zero's fuel tanks would be thin aluminum. If a bullet went through, fuel would pour out. If a tracer round followed, the fuel would ignite. The pilot would burn. Horikoshi understood exactly what he was doing. He wrote later, in his own memoir published after the war, that he had understood the trade-off from the beginning. A Japanese engine could not close the power gap with Western engines. The only way to make a Japanese fighter that could outfly Western fighters was to build an airframe so light that the engine's inferiority became irrelevant. And the only way to build an airframe that light was to remove everything that would keep the pilot alive when the airplane was hit. He presented the design to the Imperial Japanese Navy. He explained the choice openly. He told the officers that the aircraft would deliver the performance they had asked for. He also told them that any Zero taking hits in combat would probably lose its pilot. There was no protection. There was no margin. The Navy officers listened. They read the specifications. They looked at the projected top speed, the projected climb rate, the projected range. They approved the design. They approved it knowing what it would cost their own pilots. Through the winter of 1938 and into the spring of 1939, the first prototype took shape on the assembly floor at Nagoya. The wings came together first, then the fuselage, then the tail. On the 16th of March, 1939, the aircraft was complete. Its designation was A6M1, prototype number 1, serial number 201. It was painted a light gray. Its engine was a Mitsubishi Zuisei Radial, 14 cylinders, 780 horsepower for takeoff, two-bladed variable pitch propeller. The prototype was too fragile to fly out of Nagoya. Horikoshi's team disassembled it, loaded the wings and the fuselage onto two ox carts, and hauled the pieces 22 miles overland to the Army airfield at Kagamigahara. It took 2 days. Farmers along the route stopped to watch the strange procession move past their rice fields. They did not know what they were looking at. At Kagamigahara, the aircraft was reassembled. Ground tests followed, engine runs, taxi tests, short hops down the runway at low speed. On the afternoon of the 1st of April, 1939, Mitsubishi's chief test pilot, a man named Katsuzo Shima, climbed into the cockpit for the first true flight. Horikoshi stood on the concrete beside the runway. He held a folder of design drawings against his chest. His engineers stood in a loose group behind him. Nobody spoke. Shima released the brakes. The Zuisei engine roared. The prototype rolled forward, gathered speed down the runway, and at 5:30 in the afternoon, on that first day of April, lifted off the ground. It climbed fast. It banked cleanly. Shima put it through a series of gentle turns, tested the controls at different airspeeds, watched the instruments. There was a slight vibration in the propeller. Everything else worked. He brought it back around and set it down on the runway 20 minutes later. He taxied to the ramp, shut down the engine, opened the canopy, and climbed out. Horikoshi walked forward across the concrete. The two men looked at each other. Shima nodded once. Horikoshi did not smile. He had built what the Imperial Japanese Navy had asked for. He had built what Nakajima had said could not be built. He had built a machine that would soon fly farther, climb faster, and turn tighter than any fighter on Earth. He had also built something else. He had built a beautiful, deadly, weightless coffin, and he had built it for the Japanese pilots who would fly it into every corner of the Pacific. The Zero was airborne. The war for the Pacific had not yet begun. The prototype that lifted off at Kagamigahara in April of 1939 was not yet the Japanese Zero the world would come to fear. Its engine was too weak. The Mitsubishi Zuisei produced 780 horsepower, and the numbers coming back from the flight tests, while impressive, still fell short of the Navy's most demanding requirements. Horikoshi's team pulled the Zuisei out and installed something better. A Nakajima Sakai 12, 14 cylinders, 940 horsepower. A radial engine already proven in other Japanese aircraft, reliable, sturdy, and just powerful enough to close the last gap between what Horikoshi had promised and what physics would allow. The second prototype flew with the new engine on the 28th of December, 1939. The numbers came back extraordinary. Maximum speed, 331 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. Climb to nearly 10,000 feet, 3 minutes and 30 seconds. Range with an external drop tank over 1,600 miles. No carrier fighter anywhere in the world touched those figures. No land-based fighter matched the combination of range, speed, and turning ability. On the 31st of July, 1940, the Imperial Japanese Navy formally accepted the aircraft into service. That year, according to the traditional Japanese imperial calendar, was the year 2600. The last 2 digits gave the fighter its official name, Navy Type 0 Carrier Fighter. Japanese pilots called it Reisen. The Americans, when they finally learned to fear it, would call it the Zero. Its combat debut did not happen at Pearl Harbor. It happened over China, more than a year before the Pacific War began. In August of 1940, 12 Zeros were shipped to Hankou in central China. They belonged to the 12th Combined Naval Air Group of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Their mission was bomber escort. Chinese nationalist forces retreating westward from the coastal cities Japan had already seized had established their wartime capital at Chongqing, deep in the mountains of Sichuan province. Japanese bombers had been striking the city for months, but the escort fighters they had been using could not fly the distance. The Zero could. On the 19th of August, 1940, 12 Zeros flew their first combat sortie, escorting 54 G-3M bombers over Chongqing. No Chinese fighters came up to meet them. The bombers hit their targets and returned to Hankou. On the 13th of September, 1940, 13 Zeros escorted another bomber raid. This time, the Chinese Air Force came up to fight. 27 Soviet-built Polikarpov fighters, a mix of I-15 biplanes and I-16 monoplanes, some of them flown by Chinese pilots, some by Soviet volunteers, all of them expecting to intercept lumbering Japanese bombers. They saw the Zeros too late. The engagement lasted about 3 minutes. A Japanese lieutenant named Saburo Shindo led the Zero formation. He gave the signal. 13 Zeros dove out of the sun onto the Chinese fighters below. The 2,000-year-old imperial calendar meant nothing in that moment. What mattered was airspeed, altitude, and the 20-millimeter cannon mounted in the Zero's wings. The Polikarpovs were older, slower, and less heavily armed. The Zero pilots knew it. They pressed their attacks close, fired, extended, climbed, and came around again. When the smoke cleared over the mountains of Sichuan, 27 Chinese fighters had been shot down, every one of them. Not a single Zero was lost. Reports of the engagement traveled quickly. A retired United States Army Air Corps major named Claire Chennault was in China as an aviation advisor to the Chinese nationalist government. Chennault was 50 years old, hard-faced, hard of hearing, and possessed of an obsessive interest in fighter tactics that had made him unpopular in Washington before he retired. In China, he watched the Zero perform. He talked to Chinese pilots who had survived encounters with it. He collected serial numbers, wreckage photographs, engine specifications. In December of 1940, Chennault filed a detailed intelligence report on the Zero and sent it to General George Marshall in Washington. The report described the Zero's speed, its climb rate, its turning ability, its armament. It warned that the aircraft was superior to every fighter in the American inventory. Washington did not believe him. The reasons were not tactical. They were racial. In 1940 and 1941, the prevailing view in American military intelligence was that Japanese industry could not produce a world-class combat aircraft. Some analysts believed Japanese pilots had inferior eyesight. Others believed Japanese engineering, so recently imitative of Western designs, could not have leapfrogged the West on its own. The reports out of China were dismissed as exaggerations. Chennault's warnings sat file cabinets in Washington while the calendar moved toward December. But one American officer read the reports and took them seriously. His name was John Thack. He was a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, 36 years old, a career fighter pilot flying Grumman F-4F Wildcats out of San Diego. Thack studied the Chennault reports for hours. He worked out the Zero's advantages on paper: faster, better climb, tighter turn, lighter. If those numbers were accurate, no American carrier fighter could survive a conventional dogfight against a Zero. Thack did not have a Zero to study. He did not have anyone in his squadron who had ever seen one. He had only the reports from China and the certainty that his men would soon face this aircraft in the Pacific. Sitting at his desk one evening, Thack worked out a solution using matchsticks laid across the desktop. Two American fighters flying in a wide, weaving pattern. When a Zero attacked one of them from behind, the other fighter would turn hard into the attacker, meeting the Zero head-on with the concentrated firepower of a Wildcat's 6 machine guns. The Zero could not turn tightly enough at high speed to escape the counterattack. The Zero could not absorb the damage. Thack called it the beam defense maneuver. His pilots called it the Thack weave. He drilled his squadron on the tactic through the summer and autumn of 1941. His men thought he was strange. They had never seen a Zero. Some of them doubted the Zero was really as good as Thack claimed. He made them practice anyway. On the 7th of December, 1941, 126 Zeros escorted the Japanese strike force to Pearl Harbor. They swept the skies over Oahu. The American fighters that managed to get airborne were outclassed and destroyed. On the same day, Japanese forces attacked the Philippines, Malaya, Wake Island, Guam, and Hong Kong. The Zero was present at every engagement. Over the Philippines, Zeros destroyed most of the Far East Air Force on the ground and in the air. Over Malaya, they swept aside Brewster Buffaloes and Curtiss P-40 Warhawks. In the Dutch East Indies, they accounted for the destruction of roughly 550 Allied aircraft during the campaign. The Japanese pilots who flew them were the finest naval aviators in the world. One of them was a young Japanese petty officer named Saburo Sakai. He was born in a small village near Saga on the island of Kyushu. He had grown up poor, joined the Imperial Japanese Navy at 16, spent years training on carrier fighters, and, by the time the Pacific War began, he was one of the most naturally gifted pilots in the entire Japanese naval air arm. Over China, over the Philippines, over the Dutch East Indies, Sakai flew Zeros with the same instinctive precision that a violinist brings to a familiar concerto. He would end the war with 64 credited aerial victories, more than any Japanese Navy pilot who survived the conflict. Sakai described the Zero later. He said it responded to his hands like an extension of his own body. He said the boundary between himself and the airplane dissolved in combat. He said no aircraft he had ever flown before or after felt so alive under his hands. In April of 1942, Japanese carriers steamed into the Indian Ocean and struck the British base at Ceylon. 36 Zeros engaged 60 British aircraft over the harbour at Colombo. When the fighting ended, 27 British aircraft had been destroyed. 1 Zero was lost. Through the first 6 months of the Pacific War, historians estimate the Zero's kill ratio at approximately 12-1. 12 Allied aircraft destroyed for every Zero that fell. The fighter owned the sky from Hawaii to Ceylon. It flew over an ocean whose scale European navies had never seriously imagined. It came out of nowhere, arriving over targets that Allied commanders had believed were beyond the reach of any carrier-based aircraft. It broke doctrine, it broke assumptions, it broke pilots, and then, on a single day, everything changed. The 4th of June, 1942. 2 things happened that day, more than 3,000 miles apart. Neither event was known to the other for months. Together, they would end the Zero's reign. The first happened over the atoll of Midway in the Central Pacific. The Imperial Japanese Navy had sent 4 carriers to attack the American base there. Their aircraft included dozens of Zeros. American carrier fighters rose to meet them. Among the American pilots was Lieutenant Commander John Thack, now leading a small flight of F-4F Wildcats off the carrier Yorktown. Thack saw the Zeros before they saw him. He gave the signal to his wingman. The 2 Wildcats began to weave. The Zeros attacked. Thack's wingman was pursued. Thack turned hard into the pursuing Zero and fired. The Zero exploded. More Zeros came. Thack and his wingman kept weaving. Another Zero fell. Then another. In the space of minutes, Thack's small formation shot down 4 Zeros without losing a single aircraft. It was the first time in combat that his weave had been tested against the aircraft it had been designed to defeat. It worked exactly as he had drawn it on his desktop. The second event that day happened 3,000 miles to the north, in the icy waters off the Aleutian Islands, over an American base called Dutch Harbor on the island of Unalaska. A Japanese task force under Vice Admiral Kokuji Kakuta had been sent to attack Dutch Harbor as a diversion to draw American attention away from Midway. The strike force included Zeros launched from the light carrier Ryujo. One of the Zeros on that mission was flown by a 19-year-old Japanese flight petty officer named Tadayoshi Koga. He had been born on the 10th of September, 1922, in a rural district of Japan. He had joined the Imperial Navy young, trained as a fighter pilot, and by June of 1942, he had a few months of combat flying behind him. He was skilled, he was disciplined, his comrades trusted him. Koga flew as part of a 3-plane Japanese section. His wingmen were Chief Petty Officer Makoto Endo and Petty Officer Tsuguo Shikada. Their orders were to strafe American targets around Dutch Harbor. They dove on the harbor, hit a moored PBY Catalina flying boat, and destroyed an airborne PBY piloted by an American lieutenant named Bud Mitchell. They circled once more. American ground fire, small caliber, mostly rifle rounds and light machine guns, hit Koga's Zero as he pulled out of his strafing run. A bullet severed his oil line. Blue-black oil began streaming from the engine cowling and coating the fuselage. His engine temperature climbed. He knew he had minutes. Standing orders in the Imperial Japanese Navy were absolute. Any pilot who could not return to the carrier was to fly out to sea and ditch or crash the aircraft into an enemy position. Zeros were not to fall intact into American hands, not under any circumstances. But Koga was 19 years old. His engine was dying, and there was a Japanese submarine standing off the coast of Akutan Island to pick up down pilot schmelts. If he could set the Zero down in one piece on the island, he might live. He turned east toward Akutan, 20 miles away. His wingmen, Endo and Shikada, followed him, watching, staying close. Akutan was uninhabited, a rough green island of tundra and low hills, cold rain sweeping across it from the North Pacific. Koga circled once, looking for a landing site. He saw what appeared to be a flat, grassy plain. It looked solid. It looked like something he could put an aircraft down on. Shikada, flying above him, believed the same thing. He radioed to Koga. The ground looked firm. It was not firm. It was a bog. Beneath the grass, black muskeg saturated with water, deep enough to swallow a man to the waist. Koga made his approach with the landing gear down. His wheels touched. They dug in immediately. The Zero flipped forward onto its back at over 60 miles per hour. The canopy struck the earth. Koga's neck broke instantly. He was dead before the aircraft stopped moving. Endo and Shikada circled the wreck. They saw the Zero on its back in the marsh. They believed Koga might have survived, hanging inverted in the cockpit. Their orders were to destroy any Zero that fell into enemy territory. But they could not bring themselves to strafe the aircraft, if their comrade might still be alive inside. They flew away. The Japanese submarine offshore searched for Koga for 2 days and could not find him. It was driven off by an American destroyer. The Zero lay in the marsh, inverted, nearly intact. Its serial number, 4593, still legible on the tail. Its red imperial roundels still bright against the gray paint. Its wings undamaged. Its cannon still loaded. For a month, nothing happened. American forces did not know the aircraft was there. The Japanese thought it was destroyed. On the 10th of July 1942, an American PBY Catalina piloted by a lieutenant named Bill Thies was flying a search pattern over Akutan. Thies was 30 years old, methodical, and known for careful attention to terrain. Something below him caught his eye, a dark shape in the marsh that did not match the surrounding vegetation. He circled lower. He saw the outline of a fighter aircraft, upside down, its tail pointing toward the sky. Thighs flew back to his base at Dutch Harbor and requested a ground recovery party. 2 days later, an American team walked into the muskeg on Akutan Island. They found Koga's body still hanging, inverted, in the cockpit harness, held in place by the shoulder straps he had cinched tight before landing. They cut him down and buried him 100 yards from the wreck. Then they turned to the aircraft. It was a fully intact Japanese Zero, the first one the United States had ever captured. They pulled it out of the marsh with cables. They loaded it onto a barge. They shipped it to the American Naval Air Station at North Island, San Diego. Mechanics scrubbed the mud from its skin, straightened its bent propeller, replaced the damaged oil lines, patched the small caliber bullet holes, and put the engine back together. On the 20th of September, 1942, 3.5 months after Koga's death, the Zero was airworthy again. It flew with American markings, a large white star on each wing. Beneath the star, the same thin aluminum skin the Japanese engineers had built into it, the same fuel tanks that would not seal, the same absence of armor that Horikoshi had designed into it 5 years earlier in a room in Nagoya. An American Navy test pilot named Lieutenant Commander Eddie R. Sanders climbed into the cockpit. Over the next 24 flights, Sanders and other American pilots put the Zero through the most detailed performance testing any American had ever conducted on a Japanese fighter. They measured its climb rate at every altitude. They measured its top speed. They measured its stalling behavior. They measured what mattered most, the edges of the envelope, the places where the aircraft's genius ran out. They found what they were looking for. At speeds above 250 miles per hour in a dive, the Zero's control surfaces stiffened. The ailerons required enormous stick force to move. A pilot could not roll the aircraft to the left at high speed. The turn that made the Zero devastating at low speed became impossible at high speed. An American fighter, heavier, better armored, could dive away from a Zero at high speed, and the Zero could not follow through the roll. The intelligence was immediate. It went out to every American fighter squadron in the Pacific. Dive, roll, extend. Do not turn with a Zero. Never turn with a Zero. By the end of 1942, the Grumman engineers, who had been designing the F-6F Hellcat, had a full technical dossier on the Japanese Zero. Weight, armor, fuel, engine power, roll rate. Every number Horikoshi had traded away to build the lightest fighter in the world was now printed on American desks in San Diego and Bethpage. The Hellcat was already being built to counter the Zero. Now it would be built to destroy it. The fighter that had ruled the Pacific for 6 months had lost its 2 greatest advantages on a single day. The Thak weave neutralized its turning superiority. The Akutan Zero exposed its structural weakness. Horikoshi did not know any of it. In Nagoya, he was still refining the design, still adjusting the wing structure, still trying to make the Zero faster. The war he had helped his country begin was about to turn against him, and against every Japanese pilot who still believed the Zero could not be beaten. The change did not come all at once. It came in machines. It came in men. It came in the slow accumulation of new American aircraft flowing westward across the Pacific like a rising tide. In the summer of 1943, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat entered combat. It was heavier than the Zero by almost 3 tons. It was faster. It had armor plate behind the pilot's seat. It had self-sealing fuel tanks with layered rubber that closed around bullet holes. It had 650 caliber machine guns in the wings. Its engine, a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp, produced 2,000 horsepower, more than double what the Sakai in the Zero produced. The Hellcat had been designed with the Akuten data on the engineer's table. Every performance advantage the Japanese Zero held at low speed and low altitude had been studied, quantified, and countered. Grumman's design team knew exactly what they were building against. They built the Hellcat to dive faster than the Zero, roll faster than the Zero at high speed, and absorb the punishment the Zero could not. Behind the Hellcat came the Vought F-4U Corsair, faster still, with the inverted gull wing that gave it clearance for a massive propeller. Behind the Corsair came the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, already deployed in the South Pacific, twin-engined and devastating at altitude. Behind them all came the North American P-51 Mustang, arriving later in the war, faster than anything the Japanese had ever imagined putting into the sky. The Zero did not change. It could not change. Japan's engineers, Horikoshi among them, were trying. He was working on a successor called the J-2M Raiden, a land-based interceptor designed for speed and rate of climb. He was working on the A-7M Reppu, intended to replace the Zero on carriers. Neither aircraft arrived. The Raiden was plagued by engine problems and produced in small numbers. The Reppu never entered production before the war ended. Japan's industrial base was collapsing. American submarines were sinking the tankers that brought oil from the Dutch East Indies. American B-29 bombers, rising to strategic altitudes over the home islands, were burning the factories where the Zeros were built. The Nagoya works, where Horikoshi and his team had drawn the first lines of the Zero on paper in 1937, was a priority target. On the 7th of December, 1944, 3 years to the day after Pearl Harbor, a swarm of B-29s struck Nagoya. More raids followed. By the spring of 1945, the aircraft plant that had built the Zero was rubble. The Japanese pilots were dying faster than the factories. At the Battle of Midway, in June of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 4 fleet carriers and hundreds of experienced aviators in a single afternoon. At Guadalcanal, through the long months of 1942 and 1943, more veteran Japanese pilots died in the meat grinder of the Solomon Islands than could be replaced. At Rabaul, on the northern tip of New Britain, the finest naval air units Japan had ever fielded were ground down by American fighters flown by pilots who had come out of stateside training with hundreds of hours in the cockpit. Saburo Sakai flew through the worst of it. Over Guadalcanal on the 7th of August, 1942, an American gunner in a dive bomber put a burst of 50 caliber rounds through Sakai's canopy. One bullet passed through the left side of his skull. He was blinded in his right eye. Bleeding, half-conscious in agony, he flew his Zero 430 miles back to the Japanese base at Rabaul. He landed. He walked from the aircraft. He survived. He would fly again one-eyed for the rest of the war. But most of Sakai's comrades did not survive. The men who had flown the Zero over China in 1940 and over Pearl Harbor in 1941 and over the Dutch East Indies in the spring of 1942, those men were dead. The pilots who replaced them had been trained in weeks instead of years. The war had eaten the flying school as fast as it had eaten the factories. The scale of what came next is difficult to describe. In June of 1944, an American fleet of 15 aircraft carriers, 7 fast battleships, and hundreds of Hellcats and Avengers steamed toward the Mariana Islands. The Japanese fleet under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa moved to intercept. Ozawa had 473 carrier aircraft. Most of them were Zeros. Most of their pilots had fewer than 3 months of flight training. On the 19th and 20th of June, the two fleets met over the Philippine Sea. The Japanese Zeros came in wave after wave. American Hellcats climbed to meet them. The Hellcats had radar-vectored intercepts, ground controllers coordinating fighter direction, and the accurate data in the reflexes of every pilot in the cockpit. They dove on the Japanese formations from above. They forced high-speed engagements. They refused to turn. Over 2 days, the Americans destroyed approximately 550 Japanese aircraft. They lost fewer than 30 of their own. The same round number, 550, the same figure that had once measured Allied losses in the Dutch East Indies in the first months of the war. Now, it measured Japanese losses in 2 days. American pilots landing back on their carriers used the phrase that would define the battle in history. They called it the Great Marianas Turkish Shoot. The men who had come up in the Zero's shadow, who had trained on the WWII, who had memorized roll rate charts from San Diego, were shooting down Zeros so fast that the tally something out of a hunting expedition rather than a battle. The Zero was still fast. The Zero was still maneuverable. It did not matter anymore. By the autumn of 1944, Japan had lost its ability to fight the war it had started. American forces landed in the Philippines in October. The Imperial Japanese Navy sent everything it had left to Leyte Gulf. What it had left was not enough. Battleships were sunk. Carriers were sunk. The last cadre of trained naval aviators had been killed. At an airfield in the Philippines called Mabalacat, on the 19th of October, 1944, a Japanese officer named Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi arrived to take command of what remained of the naval air forces in the theater. Onishi was 53 years old. He had spent his career in Japanese naval aviation. He had helped plan the attack on Pearl Harbor 3 years earlier. He understood, with the clarity that only a career professional can bring to a lost cause, that the war was over. He also understood that Japan would not stop fighting. That night, in a wooden building on the Mabalacat airfield, Vice Admiral Onishi met with the senior submarine pilots of the 201st Naval Air Group. He proposed something no naval force in modern history had ever proposed as official doctrine. He asked his pilots to volunteer to crash their aircraft into American ships. The aircraft would carry a 500-pound bomb strapped to the fuselage. The pilot would fly to the target. The pilot would dive into the ship. The pilot would not return. The unit was called the Shinpu Special Attack Corps. In another Japanese reading of the same characters, it was called the Kamikaze. The aircraft they flew were Zeros. The fighter, Jiro Horikoshi, had designed to outperform every enemy in the sky. The machine that had ruled the Pacific for 6 months in 1941 and 1942 was being loaded with bombs and pointed at American aircraft carriers by boys who had learned to fly 6 weeks earlier. The first kamikaze attack was flown on the 25th of October, 1944, off the coast of Leyte. 5 Japanese Zeros of the Shikishima unit, led by a 23-year-old lieutenant named Yukio Seki, dove on American escort carriers. One of the Japanese Zeros struck the escort carrier St. Lo, penetrated the flight deck, and ignited the ammunition magazines below. The St. Lo sank within 30 minutes. 143 American sailors died. More Zero units followed. Through the last 10 months of the war, thousands of young Japanese pilots flew Zeros into American ships at Okinawa, at Iwo Jima, in the waters around the home islands. More Zeros were expended in kamikaze attacks than in any other role during the final year of the war. The design that Horikoshi had made light so it could dogfight was now light because it did not need to come home. In Nagoya, in the ruined offices of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Horikoshi followed the news from the front the way a father might follow the obituary column for names he recognized. He wrote in his diary, "Those pages, published decades after the war, showed a man who had believed from the beginning that the war would destroy his country. He had wanted to build the perfect airplane. He had built it. He had not built it to be thrown away." He wrote that Japan was being driven to doom. He wrote that he and his colleagues had convinced themselves the government would find a diplomatic path before the situation became catastrophic. Instead, without any strong move to seek a way out, the country was being consumed. The man who had built the instrument of Japan's greatest aerial victories was watching that instrument turned into a weapon for burning boys alive against the hulls of ships they could not sink. By the summer of 1945, 10,913 Zeros had been built by Mitsubishi, Nakajima, and other subcontractors. It was the most produced Japanese craft of the entire war. It was also the last effective weapon Japan had. On the 6th of August, 1945, an American B-29 named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. On the 9th of August, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. On the 15th of August, the Emperor's voice was heard on Japanese radio for the first time. Japan surrendered. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who had asked his young pilots to fly Zeros into American ships, wrote a suicide note apologizing to the families of the men he had sent to die. He then killed himself by ritual disembowelment. He refused a second to finish him quickly. It took him 18 hours to die. American occupation forces arrived in Japan in September of 1945. Among the first orders issued by the occupation authority was the dissolution of the great Japanese industrial combines. In 1946, the Mitsubishi Zaibatsu was broken apart into 3 separate companies. Aircraft production was forbidden entirely. The Nagoya plant that had built the Zero was converted to civilian manufacturing. The lines that had assembled fighters capable of crossing the Pacific Ocean began assembling small motorized scooters called the Silver Pigeon. Jiro Horikoshi stopped designing aircraft. He was 42 years old. He could not design anything else. The prohibition on Japanese aviation was absolute. For 7 years, the man who had built the most capable carrier fighter in the history of naval aviation had nothing to design. He waited. He read. He watched Japan rebuild. The occupation ended in 1952. The ban on aviation development was lifted. In the 1960s, Horikoshi joined a consortium building a Japanese turboprop airliner called the YS-11. It flew. Airlines across Asia and South America bought it. It was the first Japanese-designed commercial aircraft since the war. Then, Horikoshi retired from Mitsubishi. He taught at Japanese universities. He wrote his memoir. It was translated into English in 1981 as Eagles of Mitsubishi. He wrote in careful, technical prose about the design of the Zero. He wrote nothing to justify the war. He wrote nothing to glorify what he had built. He wrote that he had done his job. He wrote that his job had contributed to a catastrophe he had known was coming from the beginning. In the autumn of 1973, the Japanese government awarded him the Order of the Rising Sun, 3rd class. He accepted it quietly. On the 11th of January 1982, Jiro Horikoshi died of pneumonia in a Tokyo hospital. He was 78 years old. His obituary appeared in the New York Times and the Washington Post. He was survived by 5 children. None of them became engineers. Somewhere in the Pacific, on the floor of the ocean, the remains of the Japanese Zeros he had designed still rest. Their thin aluminum skin has long since dissolved. Their engines have corroded into the coral. Their pilots, most of them younger than 25 when they died, are memorialized in shrines across Japan and in cemeteries across the American Pacific. The Zero ruled the Pacific for 6 months. It killed thousands of American sailors and airmen in that time. It killed thousands more when it was thrown away as a kamikaze weapon in the last year of the war. And it killed thousands of Japanese pilots who flew it into combat with no armor behind their seats and no way to seal the fuel tanks around their legs. The engineer who designed it lived long enough to see his country rise from the ruins, become a democracy, become an ally of the country that had defeated it, and become a manufacturing power once again. He lived long enough to watch Japanese cars and Japanese electronics flow into American homes. But he could not undo what he had built. He had known from the drawing board that any Zero taking hits in combat would probably lose its pilot. He had told the Navy. The Navy had approved the design anyway. The bargain he had made with physics had bought Japan 6 months of aerial supremacy in exchange for the lives of a generation of young Japanese pilots and every American they killed on the way down. The Zero was a beautiful machine. It was also a weightless coffin, and it was built by a Japanese man who understood from the beginning exactly what it was.